For years, Windows was just part of my life. I grew up with it, worked on it, played games on it, edited videos on it, and honestly, I never really questioned it. Every laptop I bought came with Windows. Every PC setup tutorial online used Windows. Every software company treated Windows like the default operating system for humanity. So even when I got frustrated with random slowdowns, updates that appeared at the worst possible time, weird background processes eating RAM, and that feeling that my computer somehow became slower every single year, I just accepted it as normal. That was computing to me. You buy powerful hardware, and eventually the operating system slowly turns it into a tired machine. But about a month ago, I finally did something I had been thinking about for years. I completely switched from Windows to Linux full-time. No dual boot, no backup Windows installation, hiding somewhere just in case. I wiped my main machine and committed to Linux for 30 straight days. I wanted to know if Linux in 2026 was actually ready for normal people or if it was still just a playground for programmers and tech nerds who enjoy typing commands into terminals all day. And I'm going to be honest with you, the results completely surprised me. The first thing that shocked me was how fast everything felt. And I don't mean a little bit faster, I mean dramatically faster. My PC suddenly felt new again. Boot times were almost instant. Apps launched immediately. File browsing felt smooth. Even animations looked cleaner somehow. On Windows, I had gotten used to these tiny delays everywhere. Click something. Wait half a second. Open File Explorer. Wait. Right-click Desktop. Wait. Open Settings. Wait. It became so normal that I stopped noticing it. But the moment I switched to Linux, it felt like all those tiny annoyances disappeared overnight. I installed Linux Mint first because everyone online said it was beginner-friendly. And honestly, the installation process was easier than I expected. I thought I would spend hours fixing drivers or searching forums, but within about 20 minutes, the system was up and running. Wi-Fi worked instantly. Audio worked. Bluetooth worked. Even my NVIDIA graphics card behaved better than I expected. I kept waiting for disaster to happen because Windows had trained me to expect problems during every major installation. But Linux just quietly worked. Now obviously, the biggest question everyone asks is this: can you actually daily drive Linux? Can a normal person really use it every day without losing their mind? And after 30 days, my answer is yes. But there's a catch. Linux is incredible if your workflow matches what Linux does well. But if your entire life depends on certain Windows-exclusive software, the transition can still be painful. For me, the biggest adjustment was software compatibility. On Windows, you download almost anything and expect it to work. On Linux, you sometimes have to find alternatives. At first, that sounded terrible to me. I didn't want alternatives. I wanted the exact same apps I always used. But over time, something interesting happened. I realized many Linux alternatives were actually lighter, faster, and less bloated. For example, I stopped using Microsoft Office completely. I switched to LibreOffice for documents and honestly, for most normal tasks, it handled everything perfectly fine. For browsing, Firefox on Linux felt smoother than Chrome on Windows ever did. Video playback was flawless. File management felt cleaner. Even installing apps was weirdly satisfying because of package managers. Instead of hunting random websites full of ads and fake download buttons, I could install software directly from trusted repositories in seconds. But the real moment Linux impressed me was during multitasking. On Windows, opening too many tabs, apps, editing software, and background tasks slowly turned my PC into a heater. Fans spinning loudly, RAM usage climbing endlessly, CPU spikes happening for no reason. Linux handled the same workload with far less resource usage. My system stayed cooler, quieter, and more responsive. It genuinely felt efficient. And then there were updates. This alone nearly converted me permanently. Windows updates always felt like they owned my computer. Suddenly your PC restarts. Suddenly there's a giant blue screen saying working on updates. Suddenly performance changes after an update and you don't know why. Linux updates felt completely different. Fast, transparent, and most importantly, respectful. The operating system didn't feel like it was fighting me anymore. It felt like my computer actually belonged to me. That sense of control became one of the biggest reasons I started loving Linux. Windows increasingly feels locked down. There's telemetry everywhere, forced integrations, AI features nobody asked for, ads appearing in menus, constant Microsoft account pressure, and cloud services pushed into every corner of the operating system. Linux felt refreshingly clean. No advertisements. No forced account. No random background syncing. Just the operating system, and me. But I'm not going to pretend everything was perfect because there were definitely frustrating moments too. Gaming on Linux has improved massively, but it's still complicated compared to Windows. Steam Proton is honestly incredible. A huge number of Windows games now run surprisingly well on Linux, sometimes even better than Windows. I tested several major titles, and performance was shockingly good. But anti-cheat systems are still a problem. Certain multiplayer games simply refuse to work. That's where Linux still feels limited. If your main hobby is competitive gaming with anti-cheat heavy games, Windows still wins. There were also moments where I had to use the terminal. And this is where many people get scared away from Linux. The truth is, modern Linux distributions rarely force you into terminal usage for basic tasks. But eventually, if something breaks or you want deeper customization, the terminal becomes unavoidable. At first, I hated it. It felt intimidating and outdated. But slowly, I started understanding why Linux users love it. Once you learn a few commands, it becomes insanely powerful. You can fix problems quickly, automate tasks, install software instantly, and customize your system in ways Windows simply doesn't allow. And customization on Linux is honestly on another level. You can make your desktop look however you want. Minimalist, futuristic, Mac-like, Windows-like, cyberpunk, whatever you imagine. The amount of freedom is almost ridiculous. On Windows, customization always feels limited. Linux gives you total control over the experience. At one point during these 30 days, I changed my entire desktop layout 3 times, just because I could. Another thing I didn't expect was how much Linux changed my relationship with technology itself. Windows often feels passive. You just use whatever Microsoft gives you. Linux feels active. You learn how your computer works. You understand your system better. You become more aware of software, privacy, performance, and resource usage. It turned computing into something more interesting again, and the Linux community deserves credit too. I expected elitist nerds yelling at beginners online. And yes, some of that exists. But overall, the Linux community was far more helpful than I expected. Every problem I encountered already had guides, tutorials, forums, or Reddit threads explaining solutions. People genuinely want Linux to improve and become accessible. One of the biggest myths I believed before switching was that Linux is only for programmers. That's simply not true anymore. Modern Linux distributions are polished enough for normal users. If your daily activities are browsing, watching videos, writing documents, coding, streaming, editing, basic content, or general productivity, Linux can absolutely replace Windows. Battery life on my laptop also improved noticeably. I wasn't expecting that, but Linux seemed to handle power management more efficiently on my hardware. My machine ran cooler and lasted longer away from the charger. Fans barely activated during normal usage, which almost never happened on Windows. Privacy became another huge factor. The more I used Linux, the more I realized how much data collection I had accepted as normal on Windows. Linux distributions generally respect user privacy far more. No giant corporation tracking every click to feed cloud services or targeted features. That alone made the experience feel cleaner mentally. But there's another side nobody talks about enough. Linux requires patience during the transition period. The first week was honestly rough. Muscle memory kept failing me. Keyboard shortcuts were different. Software names were different. Settings locations were different. Even installing apps required a different mindset. For a few days, I seriously considered reinstalling Windows because familiarity is powerful. Humans naturally resist workflow changes. But then something happened around the second week. Linux stopped feeling different and started feeling normal. Actually, Windows began feeling strange whenever I briefly used it again. Suddenly, Windows looked cluttered, heavy, distracting, slower than I remembered. Linux had retrained my expectations. I also discovered something surprising about performance on older hardware. I installed Linux on an aging laptop that Windows had practically destroyed with updates over the years. Linux brought it back to life. The machine became usable again. Smooth browsing, fast startup, decent multitasking. That's when I understood why so many people are passionate about Linux. It extends the lifespan of hardware dramatically. And let's talk about stability, because this was another huge surprise. During these 30 days, Linux crashed less than Windows normally does for me. Seriously, no random blue screens. No forced reboots after updates. No strange lag spikes appearing after system patches. Everything felt consistent, predictable, reliable. Now, does Linux completely replace Windows for everyone? No, absolutely not. If your job depends on Adobe Creative Cloud, certain enterprise software, or specialized applications with poor Linux support, switching can still be difficult. Photoshop alternatives exist, but compatibility and workflow differences matter for professionals. Certain hardware manufacturers also still prioritize Windows drivers. And while Linux gaming has improved massively, Windows remains the safer option for hardcore gamers wanting universal compatibility. But here's the important thing: Linux no longer feels like a compromise. That's the biggest change. Years ago, using Linux meant sacrificing convenience. Today, for many users, Linux actually improves the experience. The best way I can describe it is this: Windows feels like a commercial product designed around services, ecosystems, subscriptions, and corporate priorities. Linux feels like an operating system designed around the user. And honestly, after 30 days, going back to Windows became harder than expected. I missed the speed immediately. I missed the clean desktop. I missed the lack of ads. I missed how responsive everything felt. Windows suddenly felt noisy, bloated, distracting, like there was constantly something running in the background asking for attention. I also started noticing how much Windows pushes AI into everything now. Search boxes, assistants, cloud syncing, recommendations, integrations. Some people love that direction. Personally, after experiencing Linux, I realized I prefer simplicity. I want my computer to be a tool, not a constantly evolving platform trying to predict my behavior. One of the funniest moments happened when I visited a friend who still uses Windows daily. His PC was installing updates while shutting down, and he just sighed like it was normal human suffering everyone accepts. And I realized that had been me for years. Linux made me question habits I never challenged before. Another underrated advantage was software installation speed. Using package managers felt futuristic compared to traditional Windows installers. One command or click and applications installed instantly without endless setup wizards. Bundled offers or random background services attaching themselves to startup processes forever. Security also felt different. Linux has a reputation for being more secure, partly because of its permissions, system and open source nature. While no operating system is magically immune to threats, Linux simply felt less chaotic. Fewer pop-ups, fewer suspicious background tasks. Less antivirus nonsense constantly screaming for attention. And I need to mention the open source aspect because it genuinely changes the atmosphere around the operating system. Linux isn't owned by one corporation trying to maximize profits from your usage data. Thousands of developers contribute to improve it because they care about software freedom, transparency, and user control. That philosophy becomes visible in the experience itself. But again, Linux is not magic. There were moments I got frustrated. Certain apps required workarounds. Printer setup was annoying once. Some tutorials assumed advanced knowledge beginners simply don't have. And yes, sometimes Linux users online recommend typing terrifying terminal commands without explaining what they actually do. That part of Linux culture still needs improvement. Still, despite those frustrations, I kept realizing something important. Most of the problems I encountered were temporary learning curve issues, not permanent limitations. By the end of the 30 days, I had developed a completely new perspective on operating systems. Before this experiment, I saw Windows as the unavoidable default. Now I see it as just one option among many. And for my personal workflow, Linux actually makes more sense. I think that's the biggest takeaway from this entire experience. Linux in 2026 is no longer just for developers, hackers, or extreme enthusiasts. It has matured into something normal people can genuinely use every single day. The desktop environments are polished. Software support is better. Gaming compatibility has improved massively. Installation is easier than ever. Hardware support is stronger than most people realize. And perhaps most importantly, Linux gives users a feeling modern computing has slowly lost over time. Freedom. Freedom to customize your system. Freedom from forced updates. Freedom from advertisements. Freedom from unnecessary tracking. Freedom to keep older hardware alive. Freedom to control your own machine instead of renting an ecosystem controlled by giant corporations. So after 30 days, would I switch back to Windows full-time? Honestly, no. At least not right now. Linux still has flaws. It still has rough edges. Certain professional workflows still depend heavily on Windows, but for my daily usage, Linux delivered a smoother, cleaner, faster, and more enjoyable experience than I expected possible. The funniest part is that I originally planned this experiment expecting Linux to fail. I thought after a week I would crawl back to Windows complaining about compatibility problems and missing software. Instead, the opposite happened. Linux quietly proved that modern computing doesn't have to feel bloated and restrictive, and maybe that's why more people are starting to switch now. Not because Linux suddenly became perfect, but because people are getting tired of feeling like they no longer control their own computers. 30 days ago, Linux was something I respected from a distance. Today, it's my main operating system, and unless something dramatically changes, I honestly don't see myself going back anytime soon.